I was kidnapped from an African village and forced to marry, but I escaped and gave freedom to my son. They took my name. They took my family. They told me whom to serve and whom to obey. But I ran. I crossed rivers, borders, and silence, with my child in my arms. He was born in chains, but I raised him free. And now, thanks to him, the world finally knows my name. Subscribe and post a comment where you are watching this video from. My name is not the name you know me by. They gave me the name Adelaide James when I arrived in the new land, but it is not mine. My name was once spoken under the stars of another sky, by a mother whose hands smelled of herbs and warmth, by a father whose voice rumbled like the ocean, and by a sister whose laughter fell into my ears like rain in the dry season. That name was Ndela, and though they tried to burn it away, though they pressed silence into my throat and branded other words upon my skin, that name still hums in my bones. And now, before my breath turns to dust, I will speak it again. I was born near the coast, in a village nestled between tall palms and red soil, where the scent of salt rode on the wind and the ocean sang at night. We were a people of water and fire, of spirit and story. The elders told us that each child came into the world with a drumbeat planted in their chest, the rhythm of their ancestors, and that the living had to learn how to dance to it. I danced first in my mother's arms, under the shade of the great baobab tree. She was a healer, known for her deft fingers and calm voice. She bathed the sick in smoke and blessed the newborns with oil. I remember her skin, dark as the bark of the ebony tree, and the quiet laughter she gave only to me and my sister, Baina. Baina was 3 years younger than I, but quick-witted and always singing. We shared a sleeping mat, we braided each other's hair, and we stole mangoes from the elders' garden together. My father, Temo, was a fisherman, tall and wiry, with a beard that curled like the waves. He told me that the ocean had a memory, that if you listened long enough, it would whisper the truths forgotten by men. On clear mornings, he would take me to the water's edge, lift me into the boat, and row out past the reef. I'd watch his arms move like branches in the wind, steady and sure. We would cast the net together, and he would teach me which fish to keep and which to release. Everything has a purpose, Ndela, he would say, even the things that swim away from you. In the evenings, the village would gather for stories. My grandfather, old Koro, sat on a carved stool in the center of the fire circle, and his voice carried the weight of centuries. He told us about spirits who danced in the wind, of trickster gods who stole fire, and of warriors who rose from the grave to defend their land. When he spoke, even the wind grew still. I loved these nights most. The smoke curling into the stars, the drumming of bare feet on the earth, the comfort of Baina's shoulder pressed against mine. That was the rhythm of our life. It was a song we all knew by heart. But even then, there were whispers. Traders from inland spoke of strange men arriving by river, with skin like ash and eyes like cold stones. They did not barter for spices or beads. They wanted people. The elders dismissed it at first, called it the madness of greedy chiefs far away. But the hunters who returned from long trips began to bring back stories. Villages vanishing overnight, children taken from their beds, and we began to sleep lighter. I remember the day everything changed. It was the height of the dry season. The dust clung to our ankles, and the sun sat heavy on our backs. Benna and I had gone to the river to fetch water, arguing as we always did about who could carry the pot more gracefully. She ran ahead of me, bare feet slapping the dry path, her laughter bouncing off the trees. We never made it home. The first sign was the silence. The birds stopped singing. Even the insects disappeared into the cracks of the earth. Then we smelled the smoke. Sharp, acrid, unnatural. It clawed at our throats before we even saw the flames. I dropped the pot. It shattered on the rocks, water soaking into the dust, as if trying to put out a fire already burning. Bena clutched my arm. Her eyes were wide, the whites flashing against her skin. We turned and ran, not knowing where, just away. But they were faster. Men on horses, wearing strange fabrics and metal around their necks. Some were darker than others, but none looked like us. Some carried long sticks that cracked like thunder. Others had ropes and blades. One of them shouted something in a tongue I didn't know, and 2 others lunged. I don't remember much of the struggle. I remember Bena screaming, the weight of a body pinning me down, the sting of something sharp across my cheek. I remember dirt in my mouth and the sound of drums in my ears. Only they weren't drums. They were hoofbeats, a rhythm of war. When I woke, my hands were bound, and Bena was gone. They had gathered us in the center of what had once been our home. The baobab was burning. My father's fishing boat was overturned. Bodies lay twisted in the dust, some moving, some not. I saw my mother's shawl near the fire pit. Her shawl, but not her. The captors marched us through the remains, down toward the coast. The journey lasted many days. We walked barefoot over stones and thorns. They fed us just enough to keep us walking. When someone fell, they were beaten or dragged. When they died, they were left behind. I clutched at memory like it was a talisman. I whispered the names of my family under my breath so I would not forget. Temo, Koro, Bena. My mother's name. I dared not speak aloud. I believed that if I said it, the gods might hear and come for me. At night, when they chained us to trees, I traced the pattern of the stars with my eyes and tried to remember the stories. My grandfather once said that every person had a story written in the sky. I searched for mine, but the constellations here felt unfamiliar, like a foreign tongue. Then we reached the ocean. I had thought I knew what water was. I had sailed with my father. I had swum with Bena. I had watched the tide pull jellyfish into rock pools. But this sea was different. It stretched beyond the horizon, endless and cold. There were ships in the bay, monstrous things made of black wood and iron teeth. Men shouted on their decks in harsh languages, chains clanked. And somewhere, deep in the hold, I heard crying. They herded us onto longboats and rowed us to the ship. I fought. I bit the hand that tried to pull me up. I screamed in my own tongue. A boot struck my back, and I fell onto the planks. The breath knocked from me. The sky was blue. So blue. It would be years before I saw it again. They took my clothes. They took my beads. They took my name. When a man asked what to write on the ledger, one of the guards laughed and said, "Give her a Christian name, Adelaide, like the mistress's cousin." And so it was written. Adelaide James. Age, 12. Female. Teeth intact. Strong limbs. But that was not me. I was Ndella, daughter of healers and fishermen, child of story and flame. I was a voice, a song, a promise made under stars. And even as they threw me into the belly of the ship, into darkness thicker than death, I whispered it again. Ndella, Ndella, Ndella. So that I would not forget. There is a kind of silence that is loud, louder than screams, louder than the crashing of waves or the sobbing of a child. It fills your ears until you think your head might split, and still it presses inward, like the blackness itself is listening to your thoughts. That was the silence inside the ship. They forced us down into the hold with the backs of their guns, shouting in foreign tongues, pushing, striking, shoving bodies into blackness as if we were sacks of grain. The air grew heavy before we even reached the bottom. It stank of urine, feces, blood, and vomit, a rancid stew that clung to the back of the throat and made every breath a test of will. There were no lamps, no slivers of sunlight, just the creaking of wood and the shuffle of bodies packed too close for decency. They lined us up in rows, 3 people across, shackled wrist to wrist, ankle to ankle. Iron bit into my skin like the teeth of an animal. I was between a boy, no older than 9, whose eyes never met mine, and a woman with swollen ankles and a face like stone. She spoke once, a name I couldn't understand, and then went silent for the rest of the journey. Days passed, or what felt like days. It was impossible to tell time in the dark. There were no sunrises to count, no birdsong, no morning fire. Only the occasional pounding of boots above our heads and the muffled laughter of the men who watched us from above. Sometimes they threw down buckets of cold slop, thin broth, or something they called porridge, and let us eat with our fingers, chained like dogs. Sometimes they forgot entirely. People died in the hold, some quietly, their breathing slowing until it simply stopped, and others violently, convulsing or choking on their own bile. When they could, the sailors dragged the bodies up and tossed them overboard, but more often they rotted among us for a day or more, the smell sinking into our skin. I tried not to cry. Tears wasted water. My mother once told me that when a soul crosses into the land of the ancestors, it travels on the river of tears we shed for them. If that was true, then my river would have been an ocean. The boy beside me died 3 nights after we were chained. He stopped eating, then stopped speaking, then stopped moving altogether. His head slumped to the side and rested on my arm until someone finally noticed the lifelessness of his limbs. They unshackled him and dragged him away. The woman on my other side watched without expression. "You live or you die," she muttered finally, "but don't make it easy for them." Her name was Kusi. She had once been a mother, she said. Her 2 daughters had been taken, one sold, the other killed. Her husband was burned alive when he fought back. Her voice had the rasp of someone who'd swallowed too much fire and had learned to breathe smoke. I didn't speak much in those days. My words felt useless in this place, but at night, when the moans and prayers filled the air, I would whisper the names of my family under my breath. I had stopped calling for Benna. Something deep in me knew she had been taken elsewhere, perhaps to another ship, perhaps to another shore, perhaps to the spirit world. My heart hoped for the first, but the weight in my chest leaned toward the last. Some of the captives tried to sing. Old hymns from their homelands, rhythm lost in the sway of the ship. But the guards hated music. Whenever they heard it, they stormed down with whips or buckets of salt water, punishing us into silence. Still, one man sang beneath his breath each night. I never saw his face clearly, but his voice, rough and soft, like worn leather, reminded me of my grandfather's. He sang not for us, but for someone far away. I liked to believe he was singing to the land itself, telling it he would return. On the 21st day, I counted by memory, by meals and sleeps. I got sick. My stomach turned against itself, and I vomited everything I had. My head spun, my skin burned. I could barely sit upright, and the iron around my ankles cut into swollen flesh. I thought I would die there, nameless and alone. But Kusi did not let me. She pressed a damp cloth, made from her torn shift, to my head. She whispered in a language I didn't understand, cradling me like a daughter. "Hold on, little flame," she said. "You are not meant to go out." When I woke again, my fever had broken. The sores remained, and the hunger, but I could breathe. "Why did you help me?" I asked her, barely more than a whisper. She looked at me, her eyes hollow yet sharp. Because someone once did the same for me. Because you remind me of my own. Because if I don't, what will be left of us? That night, I dreamed of my mother. Not as she was when they took her, but as she had been when she knelt by the river, tying beads into my hair. She sang to me in our tongue, the words like honey. You are the daughter of women who do not kneel. You are the child of sky and drum. Do not forget, do not forget. The dreams stayed with me. They brought us to the deck only once every few days. Naked, exposed, blinded by the light. They sprayed us with salt water, scrubbed us with brushes so coarse they tore skin. The men laughed at our bodies. They joked, spat, called us cargo and monkeys. Some of the sailors picked girls, or boys, and took them away for hours. When they returned, they didn't speak again. One morning they pulled me from the hold. I screamed, clawed, kicked, bit. They beat me until I stopped moving. I remember the deck, how it burned under my feet. I remember hands, breath, voices too close. Afterward, I could not walk. Kusi held me in her lap, cradling my broken body and humming something too low to hear. I wanted to die, I whispered. I want to die. No, she said. No, you don't. They already tried to kill your soul. Don't help them finish the work. I did not answer, but I listened. Weeks passed. We reached the halfway point of the journey. Or so they said. The storms came soon after. Thunder cracked like war drums. The ship tilted and groaned, its belly heaving with each wave. We rolled against one another like stones in a jar. Some prayed, some laughed, thinking the sea would swallow us all and return us to the ancestors. But the ship did not break. Eventually the storms ceased. The air grew hotter. The smell worsened. More died. I stopped counting. Then one morning the shouting changed. The sailors rushed above deck, calling out in excited tones. Someone cried, "Land!" I crawled to the slit in the wood and saw a smudge on the horizon, brown and green, hazy through the heat. Some cheered. Others wept. Kusi did neither. She just looked at me and said, "Now the real fight begins." They unloaded us in groups. The shackles were removed only at the pier, in front of men with papers and scales. They measured us like livestock, noted our scars, prodded our teeth. One man tried to part my legs. I spit in his face. They struck me down, but I did not apologize. My new name was written then. Adelaide James. It came from a list the trader kept, names borrowed from European saints and southern wives. I did not speak it. I never would. As I was led away, chained once again, I turned back. Kusi stood behind me, her eyes locked on mine. She did not smile. She did not wave. But her gaze held me. Steady. Strong. It was the last time I saw her. I was sold that afternoon to a man named Samuel James, a planter from Georgia. I did not yet know what awaited me: the house, the forced marriage, the child, the long years of submission and silence. But I knew this. I had not died. They had tried, with water, with hunger, with steel and shame. But I had not died. My name was Nadella, and I would not be forgotten. The land they brought me to was nothing like the one I had known. It was green, yes, wide stretches of it. But the trees stood farther apart, the air thick with insects and a heavy sweetness that clung to your skin like sweat. The sun was harsh here, not warm and familiar as it had been at home. It beat down like a punishment, and the wind whispered only in English, a language that at first felt like rocks in my mouth. I was led onto a plantation in Georgia, where the fields rolled for miles with cotton and sugarcane. I remember the smell of the soil, the way it stuck to bare feet. The house stood tall and pale, a two-story thing with white columns and windows like eyes that watched without blinking. Men in hats came and went on horseback, their boots echoing on the porch, and inside lived the master, Samuel James. He was not yet old, no grey in his hair, a face some may have called handsome had it not been for the coldness in his eyes. They called him gentle among whites, praised him for treating his slaves decently, but I learned quickly that cruelty wears many masks. He did not put me in the fields. No, I was too young, too light-skinned, he said. I was to serve in the house, clean, sew, pour wine, fetch water. But that was not all. 2 weeks after my arrival, he summoned me to his study. The room smelled of cigars and ink. A dark wood desk stood in the centre, papers strewn across it. He barely looked at me when I entered, only waved his hand to close the door. Then he came forward, slowly, as though this was all routine. "You'll be useful," he said, running a finger down my cheek. I didn't understand all his words, but I understood enough. I tried to back away. He slapped me. Not hard, not to bruise, just to make sure I understood what disobedience would cost. From that day on, I belonged to him in more ways than I can bear to describe. He did not marry me, not by any church law, but he called me his housewife among the other whites. It gave him an air of refinement, they said, that he had a pet negress, trained well enough to serve dinner and warm his bed. I was 13. At night, I would wash myself with salt and ash, trying to scrape his scent from my skin. I never succeeded. The other women in the house did not speak to me. Some pitied me, others scorned me. I was alone. My room was a corner of the attic, a sloped ceiling and a straw mattress. No window. But I carved into the wood above my bed the only thing I still had. Ndela. And each night, I whispered it 3 times before sleep. In the mornings, I worked. I swept floors, chopped vegetables, folded linens. I was not allowed to leave the house without permission. Once, I tried. I walked past the back porch at sunrise, hoping to reach the path that led to the trees. But a guard saw me. He tied my hands and brought me to the master. Samuel did not whip me, not that day. He brought me into the study and poured himself a drink. Then he made me sit, made me watch, as he calmly explained what would happen if I tried to run again. His words were careful, no shouting. But when he showed me a branding iron in the corner, my blood turned to stone. "You're not a field girl," he said, "but don't forget where you came from." He never used the iron, but I never walked past the back porch again. A year passed. I bled for the first time one spring morning. I thought I was dying. I cried, folded into myself, until one of the older women, Mama Jo, came to me. She brought clean cloth and sat beside me in silence. Later, when the bleeding stopped, she whispered, "Now they'll use you more." And they did. The pregnancy came slowly. At first, I didn't even realize what was happening. My stomach hardened, then rounded. My feet swelled. I couldn't eat the slop they gave us. I vomited often, but no one gave me rest. It was Mama Jo again who told me, matter-of-factly, "You carry the master's seed." I hated the life growing inside me. I hated myself for carrying it. But I carried it still. Samuel was pleased. He offered me a chair at the back of his office, called me his clever girl. He told his guests I was proof of progress, of harmony between races. I said nothing. I sat where I was told. When the child came, it was pain like I'd never known. I screamed. I begged my mother, my ancestors, the gods, anyone, to take me from that place. But none came. The boy was born in the middle of the night, in the corner of the laundry room. Mama Jo cut the cord with a knife used for meat. She wrapped him in old fabric and placed him in my arms. He was lighter than me, pale copper skin, Samuel's mouth, but my eyes. I wanted to hate him, but he looked at me with such stillness, such unknowing purity that my heart broke open. He did not ask to be born of violence. He had no part in cruelty. I named him James, not for his father, but because I wanted to reclaim the name. Let it be his. Let it be different in his mouth than it was in mine. James became my reason to breathe. When I worked, he lay swaddled on my back. When I cooked, he clung to my skirts. At night, when the house was quiet and the crickets sang, I told him stories from the village. Stories of the moon and the trickster hare, stories of the river spirits and the dancing flame. He was the only soul who knew my name. I whispered it in his ear as he nursed. Ndella. Ndella. That is your mother's name. He grew fast, bright, curious, with questions in his eyes before he even knew how to speak. The house ignored him mostly. To the whites, he was just another half-breed to be trained into obedience or sold off when the time came. But I wouldn't let them take him. I taught him my words, the ones I still remembered. I taught him how to sit still and listen, how to watch people's hands, not just their mouths. I told him, a silent child learns faster. Let them believe you are dumb, then surprise them. Samuel never struck James. That was his pride. A master who didn't beat his own blood. But he rarely acknowledged him except to say, "You'll be useful when you're grown." I wanted more than usefulness for my son. Years passed. I grew into a woman. I learned how to move without drawing attention, how to avoid Samuel's gaze when he drank, how to keep James hidden when strangers came to visit. I learned how to stretch a single potato into 2 meals, how to patch a blanket with old curtains, how to lie without blinking. And through it all, I repeated my name. My son knew it. I would not let it die. But even as I clung to it, I felt something else growing. A need. A burn in my chest, like an ember waiting for air. I did not yet know what it was. I only knew that the house was not the end. That something, someone, awaited me beyond the white pillars and the endless rows of cotton. One night, as I lay awake, James breathing softly beside me, I placed a hand on his chest and whispered, "I will get you out of here." He did not stir, but I saw his lips move, shaping a word I had not taught him. I think it was my name. The year the war ended, no one celebrated on the plantation. There were no banners, no gunshots of joy, no declarations. Just a strange silence, thick as syrup, and the sound of papers being read aloud from porches. I was 20 by then, though the years had etched more than age onto my bones. My boy, James, stood nearly to my waist, his face lean, his eyes deeper than his father's ever were. They called us free. It came on a Tuesday. A rider arrived at midday, dusty and impatient, handing a sealed envelope to the overseer, who read it aloud with a tight mouth and a glance that burned with something like fear, or hatred, or both. All persons held as slaves within any state shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free, he muttered, like reciting something foul, and then he added, slower, "This plantation will not contest the law, but no one leaves without working off their debt." Debt. That was the new word they used to chain us. They told us we owed for the food we'd eaten, the clothes we wore, the roof above our heads, even the births we endured. Samuel didn't look at me when he said it. He was older now, heavier, his confidence slouching into bitterness, but his voice was still iron. "You can leave," he told me, sipping whiskey at his desk. "But if you do, you'll leave naked, hungry, and without your boy." I stood across from him, spine straight, fists clenched beneath my apron. James sat outside the door, listening, always listening. I met Samuel's eyes and said nothing. I'd learned long ago that silence was sometimes sharper than words. That night, I waited until the house was quiet. I crept into the corner of the attic where I'd carved my name 10 years earlier. It was faded now, almost gone. I traced the lines with a sewing needle until they bled. Do not forget. The days that followed were filled with small revolutions. The kitchen women whispered more freely, the field hands paused between rows, lifting their heads for longer than was safe. A preacher arrived one Sunday and spoke behind the tool shed about God's justice, about the promised land. His voice trembled with urgency. I watched. I listened. And I planned. James was quick with numbers. He'd learned to read by watching me pretend to teach myself. I scrubbed the same words into a rag every evening and let him guess at their meanings. Hope, I wrote one night. Mama, he whispered back. I kissed his forehead and told him, soon. Mama Jo, now stiff with age, knew people. She had contacts, former slaves who'd gone north and returned with quiet offers. The underground still breathes, she said, though her voice was a rustle now, not the wind it once was. She handed me a scrap of paper with a single name, Reverend Milton Fields, in Chattanooga. He can get you further. I asked no questions. I'd learned how quickly trust could kill you, but also how sometimes it was the only thing left. I gathered small things, a wool shawl left behind in the barn, a tin of lard, a pair of 2 large boots for James. Mama Jo gave me a broken compass. Don't follow it, she said. Use it to remember which way not to go. I waited for the right night, the kind of night that swallows sound when even the dogs sleep heavy. It came on a Wednesday. Rain fell in sheets, washing away footprints and scent. The guards drank themselves stupid in the kitchen after learning another plantation had been torched by its own workers. I left the attic without a sound. James followed, eyes wide but certain. He carried nothing but a rag doll I had made him and the tin can that held our food. I kissed the doorway once. I did not look back. We crossed the back fields, bent low, moving between shadows. My body knew the land. Every divot, every thorn, every tree that bent slightly left. I avoided the main road. I followed the creek that curved through the edge of the property, leading us toward the forest. By dawn, we had put 4 miles between ourselves and the house. We walked for days. The sky was a sheet of bruises, grey and purple. The rain never ceased. Our feet blistered, our clothes soaked through. But we kept walking. James never complained. He sang to himself sometimes, half songs from home, half prayers I didn't know he knew. Once we heard riders. We hid in the hollow of an old elm, mud in our mouths, breath held like fire. They passed. We did not move until the crickets returned. On the 5th night, we reached a church. It was no bigger than a tool shed, but inside, a man waited. He held a lantern that did not flicker. He said his name was Milton Fields, just like the paper. His eyes were gentle, but his shoulders carried stories I dared not ask about. He gave us food, dry clothes, blankets that smelled of soap. Do you want to go north? He asked. I nodded. Do you want to go far? I looked at James, asleep on a bench, mouth slightly open. I thought of Samuel, of Mama Jo, of my mother, Benna, Kusi. I thought of the name carved above my mattress. I want to go free, I said. He smiled. Not a wide smile, just enough. Then you're in the right place. We stayed in the church for 3 nights. Milton taught James how to count with stones and beans. He taught me to read from a Bible, slowly, letting the words shape in my mouth, like pebbles smoothed in a river. On the 4th night, we left with a group of 7. all of us fleeing something, but none of us broken. We walked in silence, save for the crunch of soil and the beating of our hearts. There were many safe houses, places marked by quilts in the window, lanterns burning a certain way. The journey north was longer than I had imagined, weeks stretching into months. Along the way, we lost one boy to fever. A woman gave birth in a barn near Knoxville. A man was caught and dragged back, screaming. We did not stop to cry. We carried their names in our steps. Somewhere in Kentucky, James began to ask questions. "Mama, where are we going?" "To a place where you can read books," I said. "Are we never going back?" "No," I told him. "Never." "Will I have a bed?" I paused. "Yes, you'll have a bed, with a window that sees the stars." He smiled at that. Then, "Will you teach me your name again?" I nodded, bent close, whispered, "Endella. Your mother's name is Endella." He repeated it, 3 times, just like I had done all those nights before. We crossed the Ohio River under a moonless sky. A farmer rowed us across, his hands calloused and steady. I held James close. The wind bit through our coats. But when I saw the far bank, saw the flicker of lanterns and the faint outline of a barn, I wept. We had made it. Freedom was not a flag. It did not wear colours or carry a tune. It was breath in the lungs, a child in your arms, the taste of water you chose to drink. We settled in a town outside Cincinnati, in a cabin shared with another family. I found work laundering clothes. James attended a coloured school run by Quakers. We ate beans and rice and whatever we could grow in the patch of soil behind the cabin. And each night, I lay beside my son and told him stories. Not of pain, but of the river spirits, of the sky dancers, of women with fire in their palms. Each night he repeated my name. Each night I believed him more. Freedom was not the end of struggle. We stepped onto free land, yes, real land, where no one called themselves your master, where men could not sell your children on a whim. But hunger still followed us. So did silence, so did fear. Freedom, in those first months, tasted like thin soup and cold nights. Our first winter in Ohio came early, or maybe it just felt that way. The snow blanketed everything, homes, fields, even the sounds. It fell on the skin like cold ash. I had never seen snow before. Back home, the rain was warm and playful. This was something else. A heavy, quiet reminder that this was no longer my world, that I had crossed from one life into another and would never return. We lived in one room then, James and I, in the rear of a sharecropper's shack lent to us by the church. The walls were thin, patched with newspaper and flour sacks. The wind still crept through, but it was ours. No one knocked unless they were welcome. No one told us when to sleep. No one reached for my son in the dark. That alone was worth the frostbite. I took any work I could find. Laundry, mostly. The white families on the hill didn't want to see us, but they liked their linens scrubbed clean. I carried basins bigger than my chest, hauling water from a well that froze over every other morning. My fingers cracked from the soap and the cold. I hid them beneath rags when I scrubbed, so the blood wouldn't stain. Each time they handed me a new bundle, I'd lower my eyes and say, "Yes, ma'am." Each time I left, I whispered, "I do this for him." James went to school in the church basement. They had no desks, only crates and one long bench. The teacher was a white woman with kind eyes and tired bones. Miss Lillian. She had come from Pennsylvania to raise up minds, she said. She taught numbers and reading, yes, but also ideas, dignity, strength, a thing she called self-respect. It was her who first called James gifted. "Your boy listens different," she told me one evening as I came to collect him. "He hears between the lines." I nodded, not knowing how to say what I felt, that I had raised him on the edge of silence, and maybe that's why he could hear what others missed. James loved his books. He devoured them, though we had only a few: a Bible, a tattered dictionary, and one copy of Frederick Douglass's speeches, which Miss Lillian gave him for Christmas. He read them aloud to me, stumbling through the big words until they became smooth. "If there is no struggle, there is no progress," he said once, eyes shining. "Power concedes nothing without a demand." "Mama, what does it mean?" "It means the road isn't finished," I said, "even if it's no longer covered in chains." He wrote too, short pieces at first, essays about the railroad tracks that sliced our town in two, about the way the shopkeepers stared at him when he came in alone. But they weren't just complaints. They were questions, prayers. He asked why people feared brown hands, why truth sounded different depending on who said it, why God had let slavery happen. I didn't always have answers, but I listened. That was enough. We made a life from pieces. On Sundays, we cooked something sweet: cornbread if we had cornmeal, stewed apples if we didn't. The neighbours would gather sometimes, 5 or 6 of us crammed into our space, passing a single cup of tea and telling stories. Not of slavery, no one liked to speak of that, but of dreams, of land in the West, of coloured colleges in the North, of a time when our children would never have to bow their heads to anyone. Miss Lillian helped James apply to a coloured academy in Philadelphia. She said he needed more than what their little schoolhouse could give. I was afraid at first. He was still my boy, still the baby who once slept beneath my ribs and hummed when he nursed. But he was ready. You could see it in his shoulders, in the way he held the Douglass book like a sword. We had no money for train fare. I laundered double for 3 months, sewed buttons for pennies, even sold the comb Mama Jo had given me, carved from bone, worn smooth by time. When we finally had enough, I stitched a bag for him with my own hands and pressed into it a letter I had written but never sent. He left in early spring. At the station, he hugged me so tightly that my ribs ached. I held his face in my hands and said, "Don't forget who you are." He smiled. "I won't, Mama." "Say my name," I whispered. He didn't hesitate. "Nadella." I wept as the train pulled away. After he left, the house felt too still. I returned to work, slower now. The years had worn my knees, my back, my eyesight, but I kept moving. Each morning, I touched the doorframe and whispered, "One more day." Letters came often, scrawled with ink, dotted with mistakes, but full of joy. James told me of professors who praised his mind, of libraries taller than trees, of classmates who spoke of justice not as a dream, but as a plan. "I am learning how to fight," he wrote once, "with words instead of fists, but sometimes both." He signed each letter the same: "Your son, James, son of Ndela." That was the name he carried into the world. Not Adelaide, not property, not shame, Ndela. And so, even in my quiet house, my blood continued to speak. James returned from Philadelphia with his collar pressed sharp and his shoulders broader than when he left. He stepped off the train in a brown coat too long for his arms and a book tucked under each arm. When I saw him, my heart seized. Not because I feared he had changed, but because I knew he had. He walked differently now, like a man who believed the ground owed him space. He greeted me with, "Mama," and wrapped me in his arms, burying his face in my shoulder. But when he pulled back, his eyes had a fire I'd never seen before. "I'm ready," he said. "Ready for what?" "To change things." James did not come back to settle. He came back to stir. He found a job at the coloured school down the road, teaching arithmetic and grammar. But that was only his daylight work. At night, he met with other young men, readers, thinkers, restless spirits like him. They gathered in back rooms, above the church, in alleyways behind barber shops. They talked about equality, about power, about marching and publishing and speaking so loud that white folks would have no choice but to listen. I watched from the doorway, listening to his words through the walls. I washed his shirts while he wrote speeches by candlelight. I boiled stew while he practiced sermons meant not for a pulpit, but for a street corner. I was proud. So proud. But also afraid. One night, after he'd come home from a gathering later than usual, I said, "You're putting yourself in danger." He turned, tired but firm. "So did you, Mama. You walked barefoot through a country that wanted to eat you. You carried me through fire. How can I not speak when you gave me a voice?" I wanted to tell him that fire burns more than feet, that some flames linger in the lungs. But I held my tongue. The first time he spoke in public, it was on the courthouse steps, in front of a crowd split down the middle. Colored folks clapping and nodding, white folks watching like hawks. He said, "We do not ask to be your equals. We already are. We do not ask for permission to walk the same roads, breathe the same air, drink from the same wells. We demand what was stolen from our mothers, what was beaten from our fathers, what still lives in the eyes of our children." The crowd roared. So did the backlash. 3 nights later, someone threw a brick through our window. It shattered on the floor beside my sewing table. James picked it up and turned it over, calm as if it were a stone in the garden. "This is how they answer," I said. "Are you ready for more of this?" "I'm not afraid." I was. But I never said it. Not once. Then came the beating. He had gone to the next town over to speak at a gathering outside a burned-down school. On his way back, he was pulled from his carriage by 3 white men. They beat him until his mouth filled with blood and his ribs cracked. They left him in a ditch. It was near dawn when someone knocked on my door. A preacher who'd found him. I ran to the barn where they'd laid him on a bed of straw. His face was nearly unrecognizable, swollen and dark. I knelt beside him, cleaned his wounds with warm water, whispered the names of my ancestors over him. He woke on the 3rd day, eyes foggy but fierce. "They didn't take anything from me," he croaked. "You don't have to keep going," I said. "You've done enough." "No," he said. "I haven't even started." That was James. A year later, he helped open a reading room for black children. Another year, and he was speaking at regional meetings. The newspapers began to print his words, calling him a rising Negro voice, sometimes with respect, sometimes with warning. He met a woman, Ruth, a teacher with eyes like wet stone and a voice that could cut sugarcane. She wore her hair in a neat bun and never backed down from a debate. They argued often, but with the kind of fire that built homes instead of burning them. They married under an oak tree on a quiet hill. I sewed Ruth's veil from a lace tablecloth gifted to me years ago by a kind Quaker woman. The ceremony was small, but every face glowed. That night, James pulled me aside and said, "You'll have a grandchild soon." And so I did. The first time I held him, I wept. He was small, smaller than James had been, but his fists were curled in the same stubborn way. He stared up at me with wide eyes that didn't blink. Ruth named him Elijah. James said it was for the prophet who never died. Elijah grew in a house filled with books and laughter. They read to him every night, walked him through the garden by day. James still worked, still spoke, still ruffled feathers. But at night, he was a father first. I watched him carry Elijah on his shoulders and remembered when I used to carry James the same way, his legs tight around my waist, his breath warm in my ear. One evening, I sat with Elijah in the rocking chair. The sun had just begun to fall behind the trees, and the boy lay against my chest, listening to my heartbeat. "Grandma," he said, "who are your parents?" I froze. I had never been asked. I told him the truth, as much as I could bear. My mother's name was Tima. My father's name was Temo. They lived by the sea, far away. I was taken from them before I became a woman. He was quiet for a long time. Then, "Do you miss them?" "Every day," I thought. But instead I said, "I carry them in here," and touched his small chest. "And now you do too." Elijah didn't understand, not yet, but one day he would. He would know the name Ndela. He would carry it like a seed in his mouth, plant it in the earth, let it bloom in places I had never seen. And that, I thought, is what survival truly means. Not just breath, not just escape, but memory and roots. The sun was soft that day, not heavy and burning as it once was on the plantation fields, not foreign and mocking like in the land where I first stepped from the ship. It was gentle, the kind of sun that hums instead of roars. It touched my arms like an old friend, and I leaned back in my wooden chair, letting it kiss the creases on my face. The porch creaked beneath me. The wood was worn, like my hands, but still held strong. From here I could see the garden where Elijah had planted his first sweet potatoes, the line of shirts dancing on the laundry rope, the road that curved and disappeared behind a stand of cedar trees. I had watched that road most of my life, watching people leave, watching them return, watching time carry them forward like a current. James was away that afternoon, traveling to speak at a university. Ruth was inside grading her students' essays, and Elijah, now 17 and tall as an oak sapling, sat beside me with a notepad in his lap. He had asked me the question a week ago. "Grandma," he said, "I want to write about where we come from, not just slavery, not just America, before that, about you." I had laughed then, soft and deep. "Child, I am old. What good would my story do you?" He had looked up at me with those earnest eyes, same shape as James's, but somehow softer. "All of it, from the beginning. Tell me everything. I'll write it down." So I began. Each day after school, he'd sit with me on the porch, asking questions, taking notes. I told him about the village by the sea, the smell of roasted cassava, the night songs sung under baobab trees. I told him about my sister Benna, and the last time I heard her laugh. I told him about chains and ships and the cold wood of the hold. I told him about a name that was stolen and the iron hands that tried to break my back. I told him how I survived. Today, he came with no questions, just sat beside me, quiet, waiting. "Why don't you ask something?" I said. "I've asked enough," he said. "I just want to listen now." We rocked in silence for a while. The wind moved through the trees like an old choir. A crow barked from a fence post. I thought of Mama Jo. I thought of Kusi. I thought of all the women whose names never made it to paper, whose stories faded like smoke in the sky. "Elijah," I said. "You know my name, don't you?" He nodded. "Ndela." "Say it again." "Ndela." "One more time." "Ndela." I closed my eyes and let it settle into my bones. "That name is older than any map in this country," I said. "It's older than the word slave. Older than their books. That name was given to me by the sea and the sun and the women who sang over my mother's belly." He looked down at his notepad. I wrote it, at the top of the page. I reached for his hand, the one not holding the pencil. His fingers were rough from work, like his father's had become, but warm. "Don't just write it," I said. "Remember it, teach it, let it grow." He didn't answer with words, only squeezed my hand tighter. The sky began to blush. That quiet hour just before dusk, when shadows grow long and everything becomes memory. People think freedom is something loud, I said. Fireworks, speeches, laws. But sometimes freedom is small. It's sitting on your own porch, holding your own child's child, saying your own name. Elijah blinked slowly. I never thought of it like that. I chuckled. That's because you never had to. That's my gift to you. That's the reason I walked through that fire, so you could forget the heat. We sat until the stars blinked awake, one by one. He helped me inside, his hand steady beneath my elbow. I sat on the bed, the same bed James had made for me decades ago, with a quilt sewn from patches of old dresses and flour sacks. Elijah hovered, unsure. Go on, I said. Write your story. Use my name. He turned at the doorway. Is it all right if I call the essay when the sun was silent? I smiled. That's what it felt like, back then, when I lost everything, even the sky. But it speaks now, through you, through James, through every step I took. He nodded, disappeared into the hall. I lay back, pulling the quilt over my legs. The room was quiet, but not silent. I heard the rustle of pages in the next room, the creak of the floorboards, the song of crickets, and deep inside me, the name echoed again. Ndela, daughter of the sea, daughter of flame, daughter of freedom, I still remember. And now, so will the world. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful narratives like this one. Click on the next video to continue exploring stories that deserve to be heard. And if you believe someone else needs to hear this, share it. Stories survive when we pass them on. He nodded, disappeared into the hall.